Hi, friends. Welcome. Hello. If you're coming in, please come grab a seat. We are glad to see you. My name is Danielle Schroyer. On behalf of Preston Hollow Presbyterian Church, we are delighted to invite you here for the final night with Brian McLaren tonight. Whether you are here in person or if you are joining us from the live stream, we are just delighted that you're with us for this. I want to start by thanking the Preston Hollow Presbyterian Church Foundation that makes events like this possible. We are so grateful that we have the opportunity to host things like this for our community to enjoy for free, and for people all across the globe to also enjoy. So thank you so much to them. And thank you to Rachel and Interrobang Books for hosting us tonight, or for being part of us. She has a dwindling amount of Brian's books, a handful of different titles back there, that you can grab for sale after this is over. Most importantly, you can pre-order Brian's new book, Life After Doom, that comes out May 14th. If you order it tonight, you can get a book plate and have him sign it and take it with you so that when you get it, you can put the book plate in and look at that, signed book. So pre-orders are really great for authors. If you have any desire to read it, buy it tonight. It would be really helpful for Brian, and I know that you'll love it. So thanks to them. A couple of other things. If you are here and want to know more about what Preston Hollow does and what we're about and all the lovely people that are here, there is a sign up for you at the back. We would love to tell you anything that you need to know, so you can find that sign up on the back table. There's also a back table to get information about Via Forma. Via Forma is a nonprofit that is launched out of the work that we have been doing here in spiritual formation. If you are interested in getting resources that are based in original blessing and the wisdom tradition for your small group, for you as an individual, for your congregation, and you want to stay up to date on what is happening with us, you can sign up for that in the back as well. Restrooms are that way, as the green sign tells you, so if you need to get up at any point, if you head that direction, you will find them. And I think that is all. So you definitely didn't come to hear me speak. So without further ado, let me once again thank Brian and invite him to come and be with us. Brian.
Thanks. Well, first let me say how gracious a host Danielle has been. I don't want to say too much about how long I've known Danielle, except to say that her kids are in college, and I knew her before she had kids. So we've known each other for a while. So many other dear friends here tonight. Listen, and for all of you folks who are part of Preston Hollow, you better be careful, or you're going to really change the opinion that people have of Presbyterians in a really positive direction. But you all have just been wonderful, and if the word gets out on how nice Presbyterian people can be, just watch out. So you all are setting a beautiful stage here. We began last night by mentioning that the title for this series comes from the Irish priest and writer and poet John O'Donoghue, and who I mentioned last night. I never met, but I feel I'm sort of once removed from him because one of my dear friends, he was his mentor. And so I've heard so many stories about their outrageous adventures together. In Ireland, during a very divided and dangerous time. And we might have, and I've actually traveled with this friend, Gareth Higgins, who some of you might know, a beautiful author and wonderful person. And I've traveled with Gareth. He leads tours through Ireland, and he was part of the peace process. And he has amazing stories of his own life during what is called the Troubles there. And John O'Donoghue was part of that process as well. So, and you travel through Northern Ireland, a little bit into the Republic of Ireland, and you get to meet and hear the stories firsthand of many of the people involved in the Troubles. And I remember the first couple times I went to Ireland, I heard about those stories and they sounded very distant. And strangely, the last time I went, I thought, gosh, here in the United States, it feels like we're closer to those times, you know? And when you take the phrase like to bless the space between us, and to think the space between us can be a space of conflict and fear and resentment and hostility, how do we bless that space? How do we help that space become a place of potential connection and respect, or even honest difference? So this is another beautiful blessing from John O'Donohue, and it fits very well for what I'd like to share tonight. I'll just read it. I know you all can't read it from that distance. So let me read it, and let it be a kind of blessing that I hope that you can, as you receive it as a blessing to you, I hope you can also just imagine this being a blessing that we share among one another. When the light around you lessens and your thoughts darken until your body feels fears turn cold as stone inside. When you find yourself bereft of any belief in yourself, and all you unknowingly leaned on has fallen. When one voice commands your whole heart, and it is raven dark. Steady yourself, and see that it is your own thinking that darkens your world. Search, and you will find a diamond thought of light. Know that you are not alone, and that this darkness has purpose. Gradually, it will school your eyes to find the one gift your life requires hidden within this night corner. Invoke the learning of every suffering you have suffered. Close your eyes. Gather all the kindling about your heart to create one spark. That is all you need to nourish the flame that will cleanse the dark of its weight of festered fear. A new confidence will come alive to urge you toward higher ground, where your imagination will learn to engage difficulty as its most rewarding threshold. Takes my breath away on so many levels. As I just read that now, for those of you who were here last night, I couldn't help but think of that prayer last night. Remember from the old Celtic prayer, to pray each morning as you kindle the fire, where you pray, God, kindle yourself in my heart. Be a flame inside of me of love. Let me have you, a flame in me as love. And I feel that in this beautiful blessing too. Tonight, in thinking about the space between us, I sort of want to give you an honesty alert, because I want to talk very honestly about the situation that we're in. I'm feeling this a lot with this next book that I have coming out. Can I just tell you a little story? I have to protect the innocent here. But I was interviewed about this book recently. I've been doing a lot of interviews for podcasts and so on. And a very lovely Christian lady has a Christian podcast. She asked if she could interview me, and we sent her an advance copy of the book. But before she read it, she sent me an email and said, "This book ends on a note of hope, doesn't it?" And the way the email was phrased, I thought, if it doesn't, she's not going to like it. So I wrote back to her and I said, there's a chapter in the book called Hope is Complicated. So I said, I think you'll find some hope there, but you're also going to find a lot of honesty. So then before the interview, she read the whole book and she emailed me and she said, this was one of the hardest books I've ever read, because I think my spirituality has taught me that everything should end with a nice bow on the end and everything will be fine. And your book didn't make me feel that way, but I feel it's taken me deeper. And in her emails, she quoted all kinds of things from the book that told me she'd really, really read it. And we had a wonderful conversation when we did the interview. But for those of you who really, really need a note of hope, it will come. But it will mean more to you if we can face some honesty between here and there. And my experience in the research and writing of this book is that when we face the challenges of our situation, I feel a sense of relief that we can get it on the table, that it can be safe for us to talk about the way things are without putting a nice bow on it too quickly and trying to, sweep any deeper concerns under the carpet. Enough said. I think we all know that our current situation, for those of us who are older, I think we know that in our lifetime, we've never faced a situation like we face now. Would I get an amen on that? I was asked to be in Charlottesville in 2017. The clergy group in Charlottesville invited other clergy to come and be a witness for peace while the Unite the Right rally was happening. And they had intelligence, they knew that violence was planned for that day, and that there was a group of militia had been invited to come there fully armed, and nobody knew what was going to happen. And so two friends of mine who are clergy in Charlottesville called, and they said, we've sent out a call to clergy. We have a lot of women clergy who've come and a lot of clergy of color who've come. We can't get any male clergy, any white male clergy to come. Is there any chance you would come? And they said, because of the nature of this being a white supremacist gathering, we kind of feel it would be a good thing to actually have some white clergy there on the side of peace. And so they said, but you need to know it's going to be dangerous, and we don't know all that's going to happen. And so I had this moment of moral quandary. Do I lie to my wife? So I explained to her this invitation, and she made me make a whole bunch of promises about not getting killed and that sort of thing. But I went, and it was a weekend I'll never forget. I never thought in my life I would watch van loads of young people get out behind older men carrying Nazi flags and white supremacist flags and Confederate flags and chanting Nazi slogans. I mean, I just never thought I would see that in my lifetime in an American city. It was a weekend that made me be honest about our current situation. And one of the words that people are using for this, I mentioned last night, is the word polycrisis, meaning that we have multiple crises. Each one of them is very serious. Trying to solve any one is made difficult by the existence of the others. And for people like many of us, people of deep Christian faith, to me, the time is coming when Christian faith will stop being a sort of matter of preference, where we'll need to find in our faith resources that actually help us be first responders in emergencies, and resources that help us be serene and sane people when everyone around us is going crazy, including many of our fellow Christians. And so this current situation that we're in also evokes the time of the Celts, because the Celts Celtic Christianity flourished in a time when the Roman Empire was collapsing but didn't know it yet. Those of you who know about the collapse of the Roman Empire, it really happened over a couple of hundred years. And people who study how civilizations collapse or unravel often say sometimes it happens suddenly, but more often it happens like falling down a few flights of stairs. And you think, well, we're just having a few bad years. And then, well, we're just having another few bad years. And you don't even realize it might take generations for people to understand that what you thought would always be an upward climb now has actually taken a turn where things are where the illusion that infinite progression and growth could possibly happen for a civilization, that was sort of naive to believe all along. Then I don't know the future, but I think there's reason to believe that what the Celts learned in their period of history could be of a special help to us now at a very different period of history. And can I just say, this is important for all of us who are Protestant, because Protestantism coincided with colonialism. And European nations went around colonizing the world, stealing their labor and stealing their natural resources. And so for Europeans, the last 500 years were 500 years of increasing wealth through theft and exploitation. Hard work, but we're fooling ourselves if we think that hard work would have paid off without theft and exploitation. And so if we're at the end of a long period of theft and exploitation, and also if we're at the end of a long period of, the second half of that period being about fossil fuels, we're at a time, and I know in Texas it's hard to talk about that because fossil fuels are pretty darn important here. Thankfully, your state is also a leader in wind energy, so you have some people who are trying to think ahead of different ways forward. But we've got to be honest that the sort of money party and expansion party and all the rest will not last forever. And that's what we're going to think about a little bit tonight. And that's what I'm trying to grapple with in this book called Life After Doom. When I was researching the book, I've always loved biology and I've always loved nature. And there's something any of you who are in those fields know about. It has various ways of being expressed, but it's often called the adaptive cycle. And the adaptive cycle is a way of thinking about the cycles of birth and growth and maturity and then decline and death, then new birth and growth and maturity. And instead of picturing it like sort of a linear wave, they picture it as sort of an infinity loop. And the second time you go around the loop, it's a little different than the first time. And the conditions keep changing. And if you've heard about this in theory, if you haven't heard about it in theory, you've probably thought about it in something like forest succession. Imagine you have a volcano, and there's a bunch of volcanic ash that spreads, and the world looks like a wasteland. And then you get some pioneer plants, and then perennial plants and grasses, and then shrubs, and then short-lived pioneer trees. And then eventually you get this beautiful climax forest. When European colonists first came to North America, you just try to imagine it was a nation of so much climax forest. And a lot of us haven't really thought about this, but in the time of many of our grandparents, most of the eastern half of North America, the climax forest tree was the chestnut tree that was killed by a blight in the first half of the 20th century. It's hard to imagine that the forests were so different 3 or 4 or 5 generations ago. And then if you imagine some catastrophe hits that climax forest, it might be a chestnut blight, or it might be a fire, might be climate change. And then that climax forest is gone. But guess what happens? If you look at the first picture, look at how much soil is there at the first picture. And then in the second picture, it's a new starting point after the fire. And so now what's going to happen after this will be another pattern of development and growth, what they call the exploitation phase, where there's new resources to exploit. And then there'll be a conservation phase where things sort of mature. And then there'll be another release phase, and then another reorganization phase. And the next one will have similarities and differences from the previous pattern. My friend Richard Rohr speaks of order, disorder, and reorder being this kind of continual pattern. And you might see it on this diagram, that there's an old order, and then a new emerging order, and then a period of disorder, and then a new emerging order. And I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, but each phase probably elicits a different form of spirituality. Just like different plants grow in different phases biologically, if we think of a civilization, different kinds of religion grow to help people in different phases. Does that make sense? Now, let's think about Dallas. You're probably the city with the most megachurches of any city in the country, for better or worse. But you're probably the city like that. Maybe Orange County, California would be another one. But do you think that all of the money that has been made by your state and is concentrated in a center of finance and banking like Dallas, do you think that has anything to do with why? Like, do you think that Dallas people are just better Christians, or do you think it might have to do with other elements of the environment? Does that make sense? No insult, right? But it just, you realize, yeah, what happens in our spiritual lives often, like the prosperity gospel has worked really well in the last generation because a lot of people were making a lot of money. You all know there's a very famous prosperity gospel church in Houston. I don't think that same kind of church would happen in some other cities in the world. I don't think you could talk about prosperity in the same way in other contexts. Different kinds of spirituality, different kinds of theology emerge in different environments. And by the way, those of us who think, oh, we just have the right philosophy, the right theology, well, maybe we have one that fits well to our current situation. If our situation changes, our theology might need to wake up and say, yeah, we really thrived in that context, but we weren't prepared for this context. And so I'd like us to think about what might happen if we, for the last 500 years, have been in 500 years of exploitation and conservation. But what if we're entering a time of release, where the old structures and institutions no longer can solve the problems that they solved in the past? And by the way, a new politician can come along and complain about how the other politicians aren't solving the problem, but complaining about others who aren't solving the problem is not solving the problem. And so you might find out that everybody, for a few election cycles, can get a lot of votes by complaining how other people who aren't solving problems. But then you wonder, when was the last time we actually solved a big problem? See? And some of us are old enough to remember when governments could solve problems. And by the way, this is a struggle. It's not just happening in the United States. It's happening around the world. And so when we start to think, if this could possibly be real, we start imagining a spirituality that could sustain us through the kind of backside of the adaptive cycle. And when you think about this, the Romans had a spirituality of exploitation and conservation. Hold on to power as long as we can. Keep things in the status quo. Have order and control. And the Celts had to deal with a situation that wasn't so easy. See, when we use a word like dualistic, for the Romans, they could say anything that's like us is good, anything that's different is bad. Anything that's traditional is good, anything that's non-traditional is bad. That makes sense when you're in control and trying to preserve control. But if you're being oppressed by those very systems that make other people rich, you can't wait for those systems to come to an end. And you don't see their decline as the end of the world. You see that as the end of your oppression. If you need an example of this, go back and read the Magnificat of Mary with this in mind. The Romans are in control. They're very happy. What does Mary say? My soul magnifies the Lord and exalts the God of my salvation. He's looked at me as a poor woman and has favored me. I'm poor. The Romans don't give poor women a break, but God cares about me. And then she says, God will send the rich away hungry and fill the poor with good things. Do you see how that might fit in an adaptive cycle? Her dream is that the current system that favors some and disfavors others will come to an end, and there might be a break for people like her. And the Celts were in that situation. They integrated natural and supernatural. For them, nature was meaningful and rich and beautiful, as we talked about yesterday. They specialized in adaptability rather than centralized control. They didn't need everything to be the same. And they allowed for some flexibility and difference. They were okay on the margins, not at the center. They valued these small, agile communities of collaboration. And in fact, when you study Celtic history, you study the history of all these remarkable men and women who went out and established monasteries and took long voyages. It was like there was freedom to experiment and do fresh and new things. And there wasn't anybody saying everybody has to shave their head in just the right way. We talked about this last night, and I'm very sensitive to that subject. And they were not perfect, of course. But they survived in a tough time. And they had the agility to get through what we might call, well, here's what we call the time that they entered in and survived. We call it the Dark Ages, because it was a time of release and reorganization. And the fact that they survived is a pretty big deal. If I ever have a wise old saying, like Murphy's Law, mine will be McLaren's Law will be survival is underrated. I just think that's true. And here's what they did. They entered this time of disorder, as they entered this time of release of what the Romans were trying to uphold and keep control of, they entered this time. They preserved the wisdom, the best of the wisdom of the past. And they contributed to the birth of something new. Let's just dig a little bit deeper into that. One of the things that the Celts did, in part because they had been largely pre-literate in their own languages and illiterate when the Romans came and other languages were imposed upon them, they jumped into literacy, and they were interested in learning. For them, learning was such a gift, and it was giving them new insights and powers. In a sense, they were taking everything they had, and now they're learning from all of these different sources. Thomas Cahill's famous book, How the Irish Saved Civilization as it enters the Dark Ages, one of the things Cahill talks about is how the monks developed this beautiful art of preserving ancient texts that would have been lost because the Goths and the Visigoths and others were going across Europe and burning down all the libraries. Now, I know it's a little hard to imagine people burning books and banning books. Think about that. Why would anybody want to ban books? Interesting to think about. I come from Florida. My daughter-in-law sent me a picture of a sign in front of a cafe that said, "Live your life so that if you were a book, you would be banned in Florida." I thought that was great. But the Celts tried to find the best of learning, and they preserved it. And by the way, they preserved it with painstaking care. And they not only preserved it, they beautified it. The manuscripts they produced were more beautiful than the manuscripts they copied. And there's so much going on there. And of course, the people who did this were monks, and they formed these monastic communities in a very violent time, in a very unstable time, when the Vikings were sweeping in from the north and the Romans were threatening to kill them if they didn't conform from the south and east. They built these sane and compassionate communities. One of the characteristics of monasteries, the reason why so many cities built up around monasteries is because inside the walls of the monastery, no weapons were allowed. They dared to believe that it was possible to create places of peace. And people would think, I'd like to live around a place like that. It was sort of, you know how many of us are attracted to gated communities because we're seeking safety. It was like a gated community, but in a different context where the idea was we're creating a space where we want to actually trust each other. And the real value, there were walls around many of the monasteries, but there was a sense that there was something more powerful than a wall. It was trust and respect and an ethic that was being taught by the members of the monastery. They emphasized formation through practice. As we talked about last night, they were looking not just for, do you assent to a set of beliefs? But they were looking, are you being transformed by a set of practices so that your inner life is actually being changed into a more Christ-like, joyful, peaceful person? And then another thing that happened in those monasteries is they were able to train leaders and send them all over Europe. And so what happened out on the margins, in the beginning of the Dark Ages, the centralized church lost control of Northern Europe. And a lot of Northern Europe returned to paganism. And so the Celts sent missionaries to go and establish little faith communities all across Northern Europe. And many of the places where they established those communities became these lights of a different kind of spirituality. That Minority Report we talked about yesterday morning and evening. And by the way, St. Francis in Assisi was an area where some of that influence had been felt. And oh my goodness, so much going on there. In this book that I have coming out, I borrow from many wise people sort of a similar kind of pattern to that idea of order and disorder and reorder. Thinking about when you're at the top of the hill and you have to go through a period of letting go. And for us, I think what that's going to mean is a descent from our feeling of being in control and being in power and having it right to a place where we think we don't really know what we're doing. What we're doing isn't working. We have to let go of that certainty that we know the way it ought to be. We go from being sure of ourselves. It's a term that a lot of people are using for it now is deconstructing, questioning. Why isn't this working? Why don't our children and grandchildren want to be part of this thing that meant so much to us? What isn't working? And when we allow ourselves, I fought that deconstruction as much as I possibly could. And eventually I just couldn't fight it anymore. And I said, something is trying to happen. I have to let it happen. And I have to trust that maybe God could even be in this letting go. Let me say it like this. Let's imagine that we're part of a civilization that has all sorts of values, many of which are good and helpful and healthy, and some of which are suicidal and destructive and unsustainable. It's not that it's all good or all bad. It's a mix. But let's say the bad parts of it have reached the end of their shelf life, and we can't go on with them anymore. And our entire identities have been shaped by this civilization. We've risen with this civilization. Who we are is interwoven, enmeshed, embedded, entangled with this civilization. And now it feels like the civilization is going down. Our first thought is terror. My life will end if this civilization doesn't continue to grow. But maybe we reach a point where we say, I have to imagine disentangling from this civilization and imagine letting it go and seeing if there's something new that could happen to me, some new way of life, some new set of values, some new vision, some new hope, some new sense of direction. Maybe, and that's the descent. It's a letting go and saying it's possible. Any of you who've been through a divorce, people, my friends who have gone through divorce describe it like this, like, my life would end if this marriage ends, and then they think my life will end if I stay in this marriage. And then something happens and The divorce happens, and at first it feels like nothing but loss, but then they find out, I'm still alive. You get a terrible diagnosis and you think, my life is over with this disease. And you go through the disease and you lose some things. But you find out, but I'm still alive. What happens now? It happens with a job. It happens so many different ways. The path of descent. And then you get to that bottom that is often called letting be. And that often is that bottom is a place where you give yourself permission to not know. I just don't know. Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky sage, says, when we come to the place where we don't know what we're doing is when our real work begins. And he has this beautiful poetic line. It is only the impeded stream that sings. And it's like we're water that comes up against a rock and we can't get rid of the rock. And in the bouncing against the rock, admitting we can't get around, something in us opens up and something in us begins to sing. And new possibilities emerge that we never would have discovered if we could have just stayed on the growth curve forever. By the way, all of our Christian denominations, it seems to me, are really struggling with this. It's very hard for us to admit what we're doing isn't working. And we have to find a way to save everything that's good from our inheritance, but to be willing to let go. And then to be in a place where we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know. You see, if we rush too quickly to have it figured out, we carry some of our old ideas that maybe need to be let go. We have to let it be, let it sit. And it's humbling and it's difficult. But then when you let be, then you can let come. And new ideas and new insights and new opportunities and new possibilities begin to emerge. And that creates a new cycle of the circle. And then you're set free to engage with a new reality. And that spirituality of letting go, letting be, letting come, and setting free, I think is what the Celts did, and I think it's one of the reasons we're attracted to them, and I think it's one of the things that we need as well. So I'd like to talk about a few of the skills that I think we need in this time, and we mentioned the first of them last night, this skill of the courage to differ graciously. What I said last night, the right to not remain silent. And for those of you here, I taught you a 5-word script, and here's your test. Let's see if you can remember it. Ready?
Wow, I see that.
Perfect. So for those of you who weren't here, we talked about when you can say, wow, I see that differently. When someone says something hurtful, harmful, misinformed, something that grieves you, that breaks your heart, if you just let it go, if you don't say anything, in a certain sense, you're being almost complicit with it. You're not standing against it. But if you fight and get angry and create a big argument, you feel, well, now I'm just adding to the tension. Is there a way for me to have the courage to differ graciously? Wow, I see that differently. In a sense, you're outing yourself, letting people know you don't go along with the status quo, but you're doing it graciously without rejecting and attacking the other person. And so we explored that a little bit last night. Second skill I think we need is the wisdom of the long view. Many of you would know, I think one of our country's greatest preachers, Otis Moss III. A lot of white folks don't know about him because we still have a segregated world in so many ways, especially in the world of religion. But if you've never heard Otis Moss preach, I'll just tell you, go online and you'll hear some preaching. And one of the things Otis said in his most recent book, as a black man, and looking at the problems we're facing in our culture now, he says to his fellow African Americans, we've been here before. we've been in hard times before. And for folks who are white and have lived with privilege and all the rest, that, it's not our fault that this system exists, but we're having to wake up to it and realize it. For white folks, if you try to imagine and listen to your black and brown and indigenous and Asian friends and neighbors, and you try to imagine their great grandmothers and grandfathers, and imagine their life, and imagine what it would be like if you could go back in time and tell some person who's enslaved in the United States in the 1820s or the 1830s to say to him, listen, your entire life, slavery is only going to get worse. And when you're really old, there's going to be a war. A war so bloody that nobody who's living could imagine it. And at the end of that war, there's going to be emancipation. But it's not going to happen until you're an old man or old woman. But your children, they'll get to live the second half of their life on the other side of that war. But I got some bad news. As soon as the war happens, the old structures of racism are going to be reconstructed. They're going to try to reconstruct the nation, but what they're really going to do is reconstruct the structures of racism. So they're going to live their whole lives in a state of apartheid, where they're only seen as 3/5 of a human being. And they're going to live their whole lives in that state, and they're going to have children, and they're going to live their whole lives in that state. But when they're very old, there's going to be this lady named Rosa Parks, and there's going to be this guy named Howard Thurman, and there's going to be this guy named Martin Luther King Jr., and there's going to be Fannie Lou Hamer, and there's going to be all of these people who are going to come, and a change is going to happen. But guess what? 20 years after that, and the story's going to continue, and the struggle's going to continue. And what if we were to say, when we look at the long view, nothing gets fixed forever? There is no good old days. That's a myth. There are good days for some people that are often bad days for other people, and sometimes the things, when we take the long view, we say, of course, listen, it's what we all have to go through with our own bodies. We have to say, we're getting, gosh, maybe every one of us in the room is getting older. And 100 years from now, none of us will be here. And we'll be a name on somebody's Ancestry.com chart. And the world will go on. And we'll realize that life wasn't about us. And when you take the long view, then you get to the place where you can say, oh, life isn't about me. I'm about life. And my joy isn't thinking about me being around in 100 years. My joy is thinking about my children's children's children and what kind of life will they have. And I get to live now and do the best I can now. And I'll have my turn. And then it will be my joy to give up my space for somebody else to have their turn. And that's how it goes when we have the long view. It's one of the things that indigenous people teach us today. You've probably heard of the law of 7 generations, that when you do something, you think about 7 generations. I just think to myself, if every strip mall in America had to pass the test, will this be a good thing for 7 generations from now? Anyway, the Celts, I think, had to sort through what really, really matters. And this sense that knowledge and doctrines and beliefs weren't the important thing. A heart of love was really the important thing, which, by the way, should have rang a bell for people who'd read 1 Corinthians 13 or the Great Commandment or anything else from the New Testament. That love was the point for the indigenous prophet Jesus, when he lived in a time when he knew that hard times were ahead. By the way, when you read those passages in the Gospels that we always interpret about the end of the space-time universe, we call them apocalyptic. Can I make a proposal to you? Apocalypse for biblical writers didn't mean the end of the space-time universe. It meant the end of our current economic and political arrangements, when our current civilization goes through that process. And so in the middle of that, they developed the capacity for joy anyway. Danielle and I were talking about this afternoon. One of the things I think all of us in the Christian faith need to learn is that in the Bible, joy is a really, really big deal. I mean, for all you Presbyterians, imagine if what happened every time somebody brought up the subject of church, the words that were brought up were joy and celebration rather than decently in order. And decently in order is fine, but you understand, when all you talk about is decently and in order, you'll end up with decently and in order and maybe without any joy. But you think, no, what if the purpose of this, especially when you take the long view and you say whatever system we have going will eventually reach, it'll go through its spring and summer, and eventually fall and winter will come. And at those times, we better know something about joy to carry us through. The ability to face danger with stability. That danger is part of life. I was a pastor in Washington, D.C., and when September 11th happened, we had sort of a double whammy. First, obviously, it hit our city. I remember it was a beautiful day, September 11th, and I went out of my driveway, and I could see the smoke coming up from the Pentagon from where I lived in Maryland. And it looked like a mushroom cloud. It was really spooky. But you all might remember, we had the anthrax scared. Some of you might not even know about that. And this is a really big deal for us. And one of the elders in my church, one of the members of my board, this was his specialty, was protecting the United States from chemical and biological weapons. And so I was at his house a couple nights later, and I said, Rich, should we all go to the mountains or something? Is there something you know that the rest of us don't know? And he started to cry. And he said, I'm sorry. He said, it's just that I've spent my whole life knowing that this day could come. I know about all the chemical and biological agents out there, and I hoped that this would never happen in my lifetime. The sense that he knew all the bad stuff out there. But listen, it's a dangerous world. And I remember another guy said to me shortly after September 11th, he said, Brian, the United States is going to have to decide if they're willing to be like the rest of the world and know they live in a dangerous world, or if they will go to all expense to preserve the illusion that it's not a dangerous world. Do you feel that? And I think it's in all of us. What's the spirituality that helps us have courage and deal with resilience? So that script, I think, that we talked about last night, Wow, I See That Differently, is a good start. And when you think about it as a blessing of the space between us, it's a way to say, offering a non-directive and non-argumentative statement has enormous power. First time I felt this, I've spent a lot of time in airports in recent years, and the first time I felt this was when I was in a long line because our flight had been canceled. You've been in those lines waiting to get rebooked, and it was before everybody had cell phones where you could do this. Long, long line, and this guy walks right up to the front of the line, stands in front, and goes ahead. And so he's butted in front of the guy. I was second in line. The guy in front of me, he butts in front of him, goes to the counter, and the guy in front of me walks up, taps him on the shoulder, and I think, oh no, here it comes. The guy turns around, and the guy in front of me says, I hate it when people do what you just did. And then he stepped back. And it was this amazing moment. Like there was no fight, but the guy didn't get away with it. It was just this non-directive statement. He had the courage to differ graciously. I just thought it was a great moment. I want to give you a second script. Pretty often, people are going to say, how are you? And they expect you to say, fine. How are you? And the other person will say, fine. This is called, in communication theory, they call this phatic communication. The opposite of emphatic. Phatic communication is communication that just doesn't really mean anything, doesn't have a point, except to establish, I recognize you, you're here. We could just as easily grunt or whistle or sigh or something. But what if we were to see this as an opportunity? And so here's how this would work. How are you? Today I'm heartbroken, to tell you the truth. And when you say that, people say, what do you mean? Well, I'm just heartbroken because I'm really worried about what we're doing to the earth. Or today I'm heartbroken because it feels to me like our nation just hasn't learned the lessons it needs to learn. That all people belong to God and that we all belong to each other. And then the person's going to say, well, what do you mean? And suddenly you have the opportunity for a redemptive conversation. You have the opportunity to not be silent and let your light shine. And not in an argumentative way. You bless the space between you by offering a vulnerable and honest statement. How are you today? I am super, super motivated today. Well, why is that? Well, I was just reading this book and it's really inspired me that we could change our relationship to the earth. We could start thinking about the earth in a different way. What do you mean? And suddenly, yeah, you want to talk about it over lunch? I'm so motivated to talk about this. And you have something, you're bringing them this gift. What a wonderful way to bless the space between us with some gift of honesty. So I want us to just practice this real quickly. I'm going to say, how are you? And I want each of you to think of the first emotion that comes to mind other than fine for how you feel right now. Are you ready? I'll give you a second to think about it. Hi, how are you? All kinds of words. And then imagine if I were to say to you, what do you mean? What's going on? And then you could think, what would you talk to me about? Now you might think, gosh, I'd really need to practice for that. Wouldn't be a bad thing to know how you are and to have something meaningful to say. And it doesn't have to be an argument or anything else. It's just blessing the space with honesty and vulnerability. Oh my goodness. I bet you could have a lot of fun with that. By the way, this is really good for people who go to church because on Monday, when people say, how was your weekend? You say, I really have some things to think about. Well, what do you mean? I went to church yesterday and the sermon really made me angry, but I can't stop thinking about it. Well, what was it about? I never heard anybody say that about church before. They actually had something to think about. Okay, one more script. If you get into a conversation with someone, I have 3 V's here just because it's easy to remember. I'm not super happy with the middle word of this, but I want to explain. There's been a lot of research done in how we have meaningful conversations that don't devolve into arguments. And what almost always happens is people say something negative, and then someone else says something negative, and then someone else says something negative, and then someone else says something negative, and everyone walks away feeling happy because they all agree about being negative. You've just performed agreement, but it's agreement that leaves you all happy about something that's not so great. Does that make sense to you? Have you ever been in one of those moan sessions, yeah, this is terrible. Yeah, you think that's bad? What about this? And it creates this strange euphoria of gloom, People who have been studying communication, and especially the communication that introduces something new and the possibility of change, say a great way to start a conversation is saying something you care about, something you value. So we did that a minute ago. How are you? Well, I'm really excited. Why are you excited? Well, I really care about how we relate to the earth. Or I really believe in people building relationships across difference. And over the weekend, I got to meet somebody new who's from a different culture. And I had dinner in their home, and I learned so much about their country. And gosh, it was just fantastic, right? I just gave you a value, something I value. And then villain. Now, when I say villain, I don't mean you're going to pick a person to badmouth, because if that other person likes that person, now you're going to get into an ego versus ego fight. When I say a villain, I mean you then identify some force in the world that is working against the value that you care about. So, hey, how are you doing? Oh man, I just had a great time over the weekend. I'm a kayaker, and I went kayaking out in this lake, and I just love being out on the water. I got to admit, though, it just feels like every time I turn around, there's more pollution, and there's more, development that just hurts water quality, and I'm really worried about this idea that we have that it doesn't matter how much of the natural world we tear up. We call it development, but sometimes it just breaks my heart because it feels like it's taking away from the value, something that could be of value to our future generations. I just identified a villain that wasn't an attack on any individual. And then a vision. I sure hope someday we can develop a better relationship with the earth where we really value it for something beyond how it can make certain people rich in the short term. Does that start to make sense? It's just a value, a villain, but a villain that's not personalized. Because we don't need to go around just making people to hate. A value, a villain, and then a positive vision. Now, here's why I think this is significant. Because a value and a vision are something positive. So I'm giving twice as much positive as negative. A value and a vision, a sandwich. So, and by the way, if all you ever talk about is positive, that's fine, because there's a whole lot of people, all they ever talk about is negative. But I think change happens when there's tension. But when we can have that tension where we begin and end with something positive, but we also name the negative, I think that is a recipe that can bring about change. So hopefully that idea of value, villain, and vision might give you something to work on. If you came with somebody tonight on your drive home tonight, it might be a great thing if you and that person could practice this. Hey, how are you? What's new? And then you give a value, and then think of what is threatening that thing that you value, and then think, but what's your vision about how a better world could be? I hope that might be of help to you. And so, brothers and sisters, this is why I said earlier, hope is complicated. Hope that just says, oh, I think things will always be better. That's a way for us to avoid facing reality. But if we can learn to live with this kind of honesty, I think that's what the Celts did. This joyful, vigorous, creative, artistic life in the midst of rough times and political conflict and poverty and threats. I think that will help us live well. I'll just close with a story, and then we'll have some time for discussion. This isn't from the Celtic era. It's from a few centuries later. This is a beautiful church, ruins of a church that you can visit in northeastern England, a place called Clovehythe. It's quite an impressive ruin. It was built in the 1300s, And this town of Clovehythe that was on the North Sea, and it was a great place for fishing. And they made so much money in this village fishing that they could afford to build this big, beautiful church. Really quite a remarkable structure in the 1600s. Guess what, though? They overfished the area over the next couple hundred years. And so soon the fishing tanked. Right? And so now they're in trouble. They not only can't afford to maintain the church is literally falling apart, and the people are too poor to keep it up to its previous standard of well-being. So this is the ruin of the church today. Do you notice something right in the center of the church? What the people of the village did is they said, let's dismantle part of the old church and use those bricks and stones and timber to build a smaller chapel that will suit our needs inside the footprint of the old church. Do you see it there? And in 1672, they rebuilt this chapel within the footprint of the old church. And this Sunday, if you go to Clovehythe, there will still be a worshiping community in that congregation in 2024 in that chapel built in 1672. They've been able to maintain that for hundreds of years. And to me, something I love about this picture and this story is this awareness. The mistake that people made was not religious in this sense, although maybe it would have been nice if they would have understood you shouldn't overfish the area, but people didn't understand those things back then. And I'm not sure they would have had the self-discipline to avoid overfishing. But when conditions changed, they figured out a way to keep on going. There's one of my favorite quotes in Fellowship of the Ring. Frodo says, "I wish all of this trouble need not have happened in my lifetime." Gandalf says, "So do I. And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time given us." And I've got to tell you, I don't know what the future holds. I'm pretty sure it's not all a party. But I do know how I want to show up. And I'm getting clearer and clearer about how I want to show up, whatever the times are. And that's one of the reasons I believe our churches and spiritual communities are so important. Because we've got to have some people helping people figure out how to show up, especially when times get rough. And I think our churches can help us the way those early Celtic faith communities help people in those times. I have to tell you one last thing about this Clovehythe church, because the story isn't over. Their adaptation is not over. Here's an aerial view of that church, but here's a bigger aerial view. Do you notice anything weird about that photograph? Just look at it for a second, see if anything strikes you. If you look at that for a few minutes, you'll notice that the fields go right up to the beach. Like, it's a little strange when you think about it. How would they get the tractor to get crops growing right up to the little escarpment down to the beach? Well, the reason is that every year, because of climate change and sea level rise, between 4 and 5 meters of their land falls into the North Sea every year. Now, you don't have to be great at math to imagine 4 to 5 meters a year. How many years is it until that entire town falls into the sea? And just, I think 2019 or something, the British government has to deal with sea level rise and the loss of the coastline for hundreds of miles along the North Sea. And they made the decision. If you look at the top of that, can you see a much bigger city up there? They decided they have to put all of their money into saving that bigger city. And they told the people of Clovehythe, we can't save your city. You need to start having plans to relocate. And it's just a reminder that there can be small incremental changes, but eventually those small incremental changes can add up and big changes happen. And so Clovehythe will be gone. And you could do the math if you can estimate how many meters there are to the sea right now. And it's a reminder that change happens, that the cycle goes on, and that we're part of it. And we were silly to think that we wouldn't be part of it. And our spirituality has to help us face reality. And I hope tonight will help all of us think a little more clearly about how we want to show up. Thank you very much. Let's open up for questions. Thank you. So Danielle has the mic, and she'll come around. If you'll raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. And actually, do we have a question here in the front row? Yeah, right up here.
My name's David. I had just think about what you said tonight as far as the big picture.
Yeah.
When we were going through the Civil War in this nation, or the War of Northern Aggression, however you want to call it, it was probably a prime time for some country to come and take us out. Mm. Except England and other people really like getting all the textile, all the cotton from the South. I mean, so it was a big deal. But if we get into another place, potentially, where we have a civil war, it's a really good time to bring chaos to our country and likewise to the world. Yeah. So I think we have to be careful and learn how to show up. And another thing, you may have heard this, but how are you? I'm fine. Well, we're good. You know what fine means? What? Frustrated, insecure, neurotic, and emotional.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Thank you. Can I just I really want to thank you for saying that, because it's a reminder to us. Just this morning I heard someone say, in 1855, nobody guessed, people wouldn't have guessed what was going to happen in 5 years. And I don't know if they could have done anything in 1855 or 1850 or whatever, but it makes you think, instead of being complacent that things will always go the way they have, we ought to wake up and show up in the way that we feel is most important now. So, did you want to add something else?
Yeah, as you say that, I'm not advertising, but if you've heard of Helen Cox Richardson, she speaks, a great historian, fantastic. Yeah. She has podcasts now and all this other stuff. But she talks about 1850s and how we're living in a similar situation. Yeah. And strangely enough, out of the 1850s came the Republican Party that basically saved the United States government for a period of time. Yeah. It's a great stuff. So Helen Cox Richardson, I think that's right.
Thank you. And
sorry, there's so many names.
Heather.
Yeah.
Heather Cox Richardson. Thank you so much. And can I just add one other comment there? It's so good to bring that up, because, very often things have to get bad enough for things to get better. It has to wake enough people up that they decide how they want to show up. So thank you. Another question or comment?
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
I was here last night, and my wife and we have these lovely friends who would give you the shirt off their back, and they are very fundamentalist in their thinking, and we've had conversations where at some point my wife or I will say, wow, we don't see it that way. Yeah. And the criticism is, well, you Presbyterians are just, the cafeteria Christian. Yeah. So, we go through the line, and I really like a piece of love your neighbor, and I'll take a piece of put down your sword, but I'm not going to take a piece of two men lying together is an abomination, and I'm not going to take a piece of a woman should be submissive to her husband. I might not even take a piece of nobody comes to the Father but through me.
Yes.
So how do we maneuver that? It seems like Jesus of Nazareth, I think that guy, he's the answer, but he's got this Bible hanging around his neck. And
So well said. So well said. Tell me your first name again.
Dave.
Dave, thanks, Dave. That's so well said. So let's let that sink in, because I bet a lot of us have those situations, right? Yeah. I can imagine, I think what you're asking me, Dave, is you're asking me, how would you respond to that if you were in that conversation? So I might get mad and defensive and all the rest. But if I'm in a better place and I've practiced and realized this is going to happen again, then I might say something like this: wow, is that really what you think of me? Tell me more about what you think of me. And is that how you experience me? And I might just let them go farther with it and let it come out a little bit more and show the very opposite of defensiveness. And let them just talk. And I might say, I'm really sorry that you feel that way about me. Obviously, I see it differently. If you'd ever like to know about that, I'd be happy to explain to you how I see it, but we don't need to go into it now. What that would do is it would show them you're not defensive, it would show them graciousness, and it would create the opportunity for the conversation to continue. I have a dear friend where I live in Florida. We've been through a lot together, and he is super passionate about politics. About 7 or 8 years ago, we were driving somewhere in a car, and he said to me, if you people impeach our president, there will be a civil war. And he's driving, and I'm sitting in the passenger seat, and I'm thinking, where is this going? And he looks over at me and says, and I will take up arms. And I thought, is he telling me he would kill me? You know? So I said, well, Dave, I see it differently, but I don't want to go to war. And if you ever want to hear the way I see things, just ask me. He has never, ever asked me. And so I don't get into it with him. He keeps coming at me, and I keep saying, if you ever want to hear another way to look at it, I'll be glad to tell you. Because I know if I were to argue with him, he gets energized by it, and it's just going to create, and he's not going to listen because his identity is wrapped up with this. And the 5 minutes that he talks to me, he spent 5 hours on a radio program listening to some guy on the radio, or 5 hours on cable news every night. And this is what he gets fired up about. Once he got so angry at me, he came toward me. I thought he was going to hit me. He's my friend. He's my fishing buddy. Those of you who fish, fishing buddies are tight, right? And he gets really angry. And I put up my hands. I said, Dave, I'm not arguing with you, man. I'm not arguing with you. I understand that's how you feel. And he sort of backed off. I didn't see him for a few weeks, and then we got together again, and he walked up to me. Brian, he said, every single day since I saw you last, the first thought in my mind is that I almost blew up our friendship. I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I get so upset about this. I got to stop watching that TV so much. He says, I'm just way too bent out of shape about this. And then he says, it's not that I think I was wrong. And so I think there are some people that we just have to say they're deep in this, and sometimes the time comes to say, if you're going to keep talking to me that way, if that's how you feel about me, I don't really feel welcome if that's the way you think about me. Are you sure that's how you want me to think? Is that all you think about me? So there might be times to go a little deeper, but I think this is another place where the long view says the change for this person might never happen. My influence in their life might be the only influence like this. And the best we're going to get is that they're this tolerant of me. In fact, I might be the person most different from them in their whole life, and I'm the only person they get to practice being this tolerant of, you know? And I think if we can see that, it can help us and not take it so personally. But on the other hand, we have the right, if it hurts, to say, yeah, this is starting to feel really unwelcoming to me. So those are a couple of thoughts, but I'm sure you'll know what to do. But and the fact that they could say this to you already tells me something about you. If they thought you were a jerk, they couldn't say that to you. So there's something going on there. Yeah, but thanks. We have time for maybe one more question or comment.
Hi, so not so much a question, but like Dave. So I too have these, friends that say like, you're a cafeteria Christian, that, you only believe this and that. And, you don't really believe the Bible. You Presbyterians, you don't really read the Bible. And so I really thought about that. And I came back, and he didn't really want to hear my answer, but I really thought about it. And I came back and I said, I was reading the Bible, and I think I found my answer. And Christ said, there's two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor as I have loved you. And on these two commandments hang all the law and all the prophets. So I said, that covers the whole Bible, right? And my fundamentalist friend goes, yeah. And I said, so I put on those glasses and I look at the Bible, but I remember that Christ wants me to look at everything through love and love of my neighbor. And he said, yeah, but still. So, but I mean, that was my answer. I finally, I don't have a great answer for that, except to say that we're focusing, like you say, on Christ.
Can I just say, that was a beautiful answer, and it was so honest that he didn't respond. He couldn't respond. And let me just offer a possibility of why he couldn't respond to that. If we can understand that our brains are not like individual computers. Our brains are wired into networks. And he has other networks in his life that if he were to agree with you, they would treat him the way he has treated you. Does everybody see that? And he's left at that moment. When you're gracious and kind and what you say is wise, it really creates disturbance, because if I were to be like you, I would get in trouble with all the people I'm part of. And if we can keep in our minds that for most people, this is like 85% belonging rather than rationality or whatever. And it has to do with those people in control of them. This became very clear to me. I have 4 adult children, and my 2 younger kids are gay. When my son who's gay came out as gay, there was a couple that my wife and I had gone on double dates with when we were both single. They attended our wedding. We attended their wedding. We had babies about the same time. And when our son, who came out as gay, was born, shortly before or after, I can't remember which, they had a son. And our 2 sons had this in common. They were like unbelievably handsome. Every girl who ever met them had a crush on them. And their son ended up going to college near where I was a pastor. He attended my church. And one day he came and told me, I'm gay. It was like 6 months later, my son told me he was gay. So it was sort of wild. And so the father, maybe a year later, calls me and says, Brian, I really need to talk to you. Can I come see you? He drove 5.5 hours and sat in my living room and wept. Just wept and wept. Because he was struggling with his son coming out as gay. He was part of a church where that wasn't allowed. But here's what he finally said to me. He said, I wish I could be where you are with your son. He said, but if I accept my son, I'll be rejecting my father. But if I accept my father, I have to reject my son. Do you feel it? That's the agony that people are in. And, part of me wanted to say to him, you're an adult. Your job is to make your choice. Who needs you more, you know? Who does your acceptance matter to more? And I said, you know, but I was compassionate. I helped him sort that through. And what happened is, a couple of years later, his son got married. And to my friend's utter surprise, his father came to the wedding and was gracious throughout the day. And he found out that his father was way more loving than he thought he would be, you know. And so sometimes these things happen, but it's a process, and it involves a lot of pain, and it involves shifts in belonging. And when we realize that there are people who are gaining enormous power and money and wealth and prestige by making us hate each other, and they're gaining power by making some of us afraid of others. That's why when many of us are in the position of being the ones who are seen as cafeteria Christians and all kinds of other ways to really insult us, you know. But if we can be gracious and show love back and make clear that we accept them even in spite of the disagreement, if the time ever changes and they're ready to make a change, they know there's a place where they'll receive some belonging. And that's what is so important about gatherings like this and churches like the ones that all of you represent. We need those places. We can bless the space between us. I'll close with this prayer. Last night we talked about indigeneity and when we need voices from cultures that aren't part of our civilization's structures and value systems. And this is a prayer from the Ute people. And it might strike you that it's a prayer to the earth. But could I maybe say, if we know that Celtic prayer, Christ above me, Christ below me, we could think of this as praying. As we pray to Christ below me, this is one of the places that the Spirit of God, who's in all that is, right? We're speaking there. So I'll read this as a meditation or a prayer for us tonight. Earth, teach me stillness as the grasses are stilled with light. Earth, teach me suffering as old stones suffer with memory. Earth, teach me humility as blossoms are humble with beginning. Earth, teach me caring as the mother who secures her young. Earth, teach me courage as the tree which stands alone. Earth, teach me limitation as the ant which crawls on the ground. Earth, teach me freedom as the eagle which soars in the sky. Earth, teach me resignation as the leaves which die in the fall. Earth, teach me regeneration as the seed which rises in the spring. Earth, teach me to forget myself as melted snow forgets its life. Earth, teach me to remember kindness as dry fields weep in the rain. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
As Brian was praying that, we actually have that St. Patrick's breastplate prayer, and if you want one, they're on the way out, and we would love for you to take one with us, with you. They've been it's been a companion this year as we've traveled the Celtic way. It's a helpful way to ground ourselves in the love that we hope guides us to bless the space between us. I'm so grateful for you coming. If I may say, Brian, we knew you were the right person for this because for 20 years I have watched you show up, and I've seen a little behind the scenes of what it's cost you to show up. And so may I very publicly say, thank you for so faithfully showing up for so long. With integrity and kindness and conviction. When I think about how I want to be with someone who is courageous and also always kind and Christ-like, I always think of you first. So thank you for showing us that way today and this whole weekend. There are books for sale in the back. If you brought a book with you, you can go have Brian sign it. Thank you so much for coming, and go in peace.